This is going to be a continuation of the last lecture because, as I have said earlier, the aim of our study is basically of this whole course is to understand how free Pakistani media is and how is it operating. So that's basically the functional introduction of media system in Pakistan. Oh, I've shared a couple of documents with you. If you go through these, you can understand uh, the state of media freedom in Pakistan. And I'm sharing these documents again in this uh, slide share. Now, as we discuss the broader idea of restrictions or freedom in, of media in Pakistan, we are going into the specifics this time around. Uh, why I'm using the word restrictions, because most of the time the government press relations in Pakistan never remained complementary. Like they always were on the dividing side. If we look at the media right now, at this moment, we see government and media as two opposing forces. And media is seen as an institution that has very different stakes than the government in power. Media seems to be uh, getting benefits out of its opposition to the government. But this was not the case in the beginning. Media was a free institution that was trying to fulfill its democratic duty. The transformation from that to what we have today, where both the government and the media have become incredible, is a huge loss for Pakistani democracy. We should always keep in mind, as students of media and students of media history, that it is important uh, to stick to your functional role. Since we are not in the government, but we are rather people who work in the media, we have to understand where should we stand, like what should be our main focus. Like our main focus shouldn't be uh, fulfilling anybody's agendas or being for or against somebody because of anything else than our right to gather information and our right to dispense information freely and objectively. That's what journalism is all about. And this is what journalism in the first 20, 30, 40 years did. The big loss came, I think, after the advent of private television, not because privatization of television or allowing private television and radio was anything wrong. It was important. But the way this authority was, freedom was abused, created problems. Now, I won't say that the media decided to abuse these freedoms, but rather the government and media both developed an environment where a free and impartial media system was not possible. In the beginning, after the independence, media thought of itself as an institution uh, whose job was to confront power for the benefit of its readers, its audience, and they also knew their responsibility toward the society. It was very obvious if you go back into history that after the struggle against colonial powers, the Pakistani media was well set to serve its people as an independent institution. Uh, it was very much in line with the UN uh, charter, what we call the Human Rights Charter, Article 19 of the UN uh, Charter. But it changed. So here is a historical development of restrictions. That's why we talk about restrictions. There are many, but a few of these are very obvious. Like first and foremost, we might think that it's new that government is or institutions, individuals are bribing journalists or newspapers or media industry. Uh, but it's not new. It began in the 1950s. The first one that comes into play was, I think, 1950 or 51. We'll discuss it. Harassment. Harassment is also one element which really forces you into uh, self censorship. And it has happened. It has repeatedly happened, and it's increasing. But we will look at uh, the way it happens. Governmental pressure, like governmental pressure to do something, like without any legal provision, without any uh, logical reason to ask somebody to do something directly, but rather indirectly pressurizing the media. That has happened from the very beginning. Legal provisions are there, like laws and acts. Constitutional guarantees not fully observed. We have talked about it in the last lecture also, that the way the Constitution is, mm, the way the Constitution decides uh, the rights of the media, these are seldom observed in that way by the government, because it has its own stakes and individuals have powers, and it's about power centers, not about the Constitution itself. Advertisement policy of the government, we'll discuss it separately in the next lecture. And also non-state actors operating with impunity. In our era, we are seeing it so very commonly that some people just start abusing media institutions, or physically harm them or harass them. And these are different groups which are not directly connected to the government, but are acting independently. But they can just get away with anything that they do. These are linguistic groups, as we have seen in Karachi. These are ethnic groups. These are religious sectarian groups, and all these people uh, create an environment where media cannot function properly, especially individual journalists. For individual journalists, it becomes really difficult to operate, keeping in view that if they are targeted, there is no safety net for them to fall down to. So let's discuss a couple of these. Bribery. This is what I see. If we look at the government's policy towards the media, we can see it the age-old way of carrot and stick, like the carrot to win those who would accept that, and the stick to punish those who won't do that. We can see evidences of bribery from the very inception of the government in Pakistan. And the first of them was a list of journalists, newspapers who were receiving some money. I don't know whether it's for 200 or 2,000. And the list is then leaked as it happens. And this was one of them was the anti-Ahmadi movement in the early 50s. And for that, even newspapers like Zamindar, Maulana Zafar Ali Khan was not no more there, but the newspaper was there. And even Zamindar was amongst the newspapers accepting money uh, from the government. And it's the government's payroll, as they call it. So if we go into the detail, if you are a working journalist, you will know that different journalists at times work on payroll of different institutions. The much discussed payroll of the intelligence agencies is on the one hand, but all institutions like WAPDA pays, banks pay, everybody just keep media relations is sometimes stooping too low to become like monetary bribes. Even yesterday, the government spokesperson, it was, I think yesterday means 17th of January 2021. The government spokesperson, Shibli Faraz, was talking, and then there was another guy who is an assistant. I don't know what it is, but he mentioned what the previous government did, and then he said that there was 5 crore rupees, like 50 million rupees, that the previous government has taken by saying that this is the money spent on media. Like he was implicating that those 50 million rupees were given to journalists or media institution, and he said there was no record, and he was saying it to the press that this money was taken in your name. This was also a blanket threat that we know the names, like kind of that. And so mostly, if any journalist accepts money or any institution accepts money, they should know that this will be used against them whenever they don't do the bidding of a particular person or a government or an institution. So there are these perks, but then there are these dangers a lot with them. And then plots and perks like foreign visits, scoops. Like the present government became very unpopular when they didn't take uh, hundreds of journalists to the UN General Assembly meeting, and only 4 or 5 people went, and everybody was just unhappy because this has become a routine that when the Prime Minister flies, or a minister at that time was president, there is a huge group of journalists flying with them, staying in five-star hotels, having daily expenses covered, and then why and nobody thinks why do they do that? Because if you are going for coverage of any institution, it your institution should pay for that. If they can't pay for that, you shouldn't be part of the entourage of a state dignitary, because then you will be covering their version and not the real version of what's going on. And that's the problem. So journalists take it for granted. They think that the government should pay for those visits, but the government is paying uh, because they want to have their own narrative in the media. So that's why always foreign visits are positively covered, because foreign visits are uh, also part of the foreign visits is all these perks that the journalists get. Uh, Also, plots allotted to media persons is the kind of bribery that happens. It started and it's not ending. So you will see media colonies by the government, provincial, federal, always. And they'll be, so there are, these are one, and also donations to press clubs, things like that, and everything happening. Then scoops. Scoops means an exclusive story. Some of the journalists who are hobnobbing with state functionaries and giving them positive coverage also get new exclusive news stories, which others don't. This is also kind of a bribe that they take. And along with that, there is also a history of government sowing the seeds of division between journalist unions, especially the Pakistan Federal Union of Journalists. It happened during the 80s, during General Ziaul Haq's regime, when and a parallel group was developed against the main group, which had a lot of contributions. And that group was supported by the government and many newspapers who were in favor of that government. So that small group basically divided the Pakistan Federal Union of Journalists, which is the biggest body for the working journalists, with its chapters in every province. So once that division was created, the body became ineffective, because then there was not one single voice, but rather different voices speaking different languages, and uh, there was always a division, and there was always confrontation, which really made the Pakistan Federal Union of Journalists ineffective. Harassment. Since we are talking about in a historical perspective, individual journalists harassment was not uh, not there in the beginning because the government didn't think that individual journalists were that powerful. It was direct confrontation with the media owners, and uh, the media owners' harassment was there even before, uh, like even before the martial law. But the 1958 martial law really brought a lot of changes. But we might think that harassment of individual journalists, something that we'll discuss later, is something which came with social media because you were born and raised in the almost in the age of social media. But it's not new. Like this has been a routine from many decades. Uh, I see many of these, but one of these is kind of when the former Prime Minister and the founder of Pakistan People's Party, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, said in one of his speech, named a journalist who was, I think, Associated Press of Pakistan journalist, and said that he will fix them. And if you say it in a procession, uh, people might kill him if he's there, because people were really, he had a huge following. And naming an individual journalist means that you are directly targeting an individual because of something that he's doing as part of his duty. So it goes back into the 1960s. Uh, and during General Ayub Khan's martial law, uh, beating up college students, uh, even in the courts, because they took refuge in court premises, as well as attacks on journalists was common. But journalists were not the direct uh, target of that time. But harassment was there. But during those days, harassment was restricted to institutions. The first and foremost act of Pakistani government, which I think somehow is tantamount to harassment, is the Press Commission of 1954, which was formed to know whether the Pakistani press is loyal. Uh, as I've said earlier, that a government which was only 7 years old was not entitled to start investigating other institutions only because there were certain individuals and newspapers that were challenging its actions. They were doing their job. So that investigation ended almost in 1958, and the Press Commission's report told uh, very clearly that the press was loyal, there was no problem with it, and it was performing its duties. And then came the military takeover in 1958, and there were three very important things that are, these are in fact two, but I have just added one to those. The first and foremost was the National Press Trust. The National Press Trust was formed uh, to take over newspapers, independent newspapers. These were vocal critics of the newspaper. The biggest target at that time was Progressive Papers Limited, which was owned by a Lahorite, Mia Iftikharuddin, who was the uh, president of Pakistan Communist Party of Pakistan. He was earlier in Muslim League, and he was a landowner and an industrialist, and also owned Progressive Papers Limited. His newspapers were Pakistan Times. The editor of Pakistan Times was Faiz Ahmed Faiz. Chirag Hassan Harsrat, a very famous writer, was the editor of the Urdu daily Imroz. And then the weekly Lelo Nehar was headed by Ahmed Nadeem Qasmi. So big uh, literary figures. It was taken over. And along with that, the National Press Trust also took over Mashriq and a few others very vocal newspapers and started operating them under government patronage. Now they became government mouthpieces in the same vein as uh, Radio Pakistan. Television came later. Then there was this Writers Guild. Writers Guild was basically formed since if you see all these three journalists were also famous writers, like poets and writers. Ahmed Nazim Qasmi, Faiz Ahmed Faiz were very famous poets. Everybody knows them. Chirag Hasan Hasrat also a very good writer. So what the government did was they created a writers guild, and they all the writers who were part of the writers guild were given a lot of support, monetary, publishing, and everything. Ahmed Nadeem Qasmi unfortunately became uh, the head of the Writers Guild. And so that's how a division amongst intelligentsia was created. The New Leaf was basically an editorial that the government wrote. People say that close aide of General Ayub Khan, Qudratullah Shahab wrote that. And the New Leaf was about Progressive Papers Limited. Like it said that what they were doing was wrong, but now they have turned a new leaf and a new life for these Urdu and English newspapers have begun, and now they will serve the country. Meaning, earlier they were not serving the country, they were doing something that was against the country. Now, everybody published it. It was mandatory to publish this editorial for every newspaper in Pakistan, English and Urdu. The one newspaper that refused to do that was Imroz. Chirag Hasan Nasrat refused to publish. He left the job. Faiz Ahmed Faiz did publish it, by the way. He published it. He was editor of the Pakistan Times. Chirag Hasan Nasrat said that since it is against the newspaper that that he's working in as editor, he won't publish it because it's what we call insult added to injury. So he didn't do that. Faiz later said that he regretted that, but that's where he failed. He failed on many other occasions also. So here we see this was a very organized way of not simply uh, harming the press, but also discrediting it. And we have seen this in the recent developments in the US, discrediting the media. So one of the main instruments of I would say former president, it's only 2 days left, Donald Trump's uh, schemes of controlling the media, or controlling what we call the narrative in the country, in the US, was discrediting mainstream media, like talking against and making them do things that they shouldn't be. Like the US media didn't do what uh, the president's bidding, but still it got discredited because there was an alternative reality created, what we know as fake news or as alternative truth. We'll discuss that later. So that was the very environment which almost was set in the late 50s, where it became easier to discredit the media. And then we come to the legal provisions. Now, I haven't discussed it much. It's the Press and Publication Ordinance, which was promulgated in 1960 and then again repromulgated in 1963. In 1960, it was promulgated. The repromulgation was that instead of the Chief Martial Law Administrator, in 1963, President Ayub Khan took over as president. So repromulgation of the ordinance was basically because of that. There was no difference. And then we have registration of printing presses and publication ordinance, RPPPO 1988. Now keep in mind that an ordinance is only effective for 3 months. And it can only be passed when the assembly is not in session. It ends after 3 months or with the beginning of the assembly session, whichever comes earlier. But these are the ordinances which the government, the military and other governments, civilian governments, kept in place. Like they were never discussed in the parliament, and they were always being repromulgated by the presidents. So here we can see how serious government, even civilian governments were uh, when it comes to freedom of press or media. They were never serious about that. Otherwise, they would have gone to the parliament, discussed it, and then given it to the committees, given it to the people, and the people would have decided, and the experts and the parliament would have decided what should be the structure of laws against about the press in Pakistan. They didn't do that. Then there are specific clauses in the Pakistan Penal Code. Now here comes the assignment, by the way, and this is your final assignment. I'll write it, but I'm saying it right now. I have also shared a commentary on the press laws by the SPDI and given you a link to media laws in Pakistan. Now, what I would like to have as your, uh, I won't say the final assignment, but this is one of the two assignments that will constitute your final exam. Uh, I would like you to review different clauses of media freedom and decide, review the press laws as given on the website. All of them are available. And also read the commentary and give your own opinion on how you see the freedom of press in Pakistan within the light of constitution and the laws that are applicable to the media. That's one of the two assignments which will constitute your final exam. I'll decide how many marks it will have, but it will have more than 10. I think at the minimum it will have 15% of your marks. But this is one of the two assignments. And I'll check it for originality and your own opinion. I'll surely would like to see an argument developed, uh, laws cited, constitutional action cited, and then commentaries given. You can search the web and see, research what different newspapers or media organizations say about it. You want to read books, there are many books. You can also read my book, part of it, and you have to find it out on your own where it's written. Only tip is that it's written in the first part of my dissertation, which is 85 pages, but there are subtitles and side titles you can see where I discuss that. It's important for me that you go through the course and you see where the restrictions are and how do they operate, who did that, and all that. So that's the assignment. So keep in mind, I'll give you the date of submission, and then so this is kind of half of your final exam. So that's it. Uh, Keep in mind that I have shared all the needed readings with you. Those who have listened to the lectures and went through the readings know everything about it. Those who haven't would fail to do that. One final word, and I don't want to say it, but since it's so obvious, in case of cheating, you will get an F. I'm sorry, but if I am able to prove, which is not that difficult, that you have cheated, all earlier submissions will stand null and void. I'm not threatening you, but I'm just telling you that this is the way it is going to be. Because the way I always say, we are here to give maximum credit to the ones who deserve it. If we don't do that, the whole education system becomes a farce. And that's not right. Because students who work hard to achieve something should get that benefit. Those who don't should get what they have worked for. So thank you very much.